Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. What a exciting and eventful morning. We like to keep things exciting at the Kale Conference. So glad you could all join us. I'm Matt Waltz, Senior Vice President of Partnerships and Development at Kale. And thank you for joining this morning for a discussion on the always timely topic of federal policy. I think we know a few things have happened in the last couple of days, so it's a great time to have a conversation. Policy priorities tend to ebb and flow depending on who is in office and other factors. And that certainly has been the case over Kale's 5 decades of existence. But throughout that time, Kale has consistently argued that we can't view education, training, and workforce development as isolated niches. Instead, they must complement each other as part of an integrated education and employment ecosystem. And today, that's more evident than ever. In the private sector, AI and other tech, as well as greater adoption of competency-based approaches to hiring, are changing the labor market in ways that demand greater agility and aligning curricula to shifting workforce needs. On the policy front, we're seeing lines blur between the departments of education and labor. I think that's probably an understatement. You'll hear a lot of discussion framing this as an either-or competition, college versus trade school, degree versus an apprenticeship. But at Kale, we believe the answer can and should be both and an on-ramp to one pathway shouldn't be an obstacle to others. That's why so much of Kale's work is making sure the right stakeholders are at the table, connecting our employer and workforce development partners with our strong base of higher education practitioners. The Kale community understands that we can accomplish much more together than we can apart, no matter how much our individual missions may already resonate around serving adult learners and workers. So with that said, I'm delighted to introduce today's panel. They provide an excellent sampling of perspectives that can help us ensure that we are meeting adult learners and workers where they are today and positioning them to get where they aspire to be tomorrow. Our moderator, Ted Eismeyer, who's a Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors and heads the post-secondary communications there. He's joined by Melissa Robbins, CEO of the National Association of Workforce Development Professionals. We also have John Colburn, Executive Director of Apprenticeships for America, and Alex Davis, a Director at Whiteboard Advisors. So thanks everybody for being here. We're really excited and enjoyed the discussion. I'll turn it over to Ted.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Matt, for the generous introduction. Everybody give Matt a round of applause. And thank you to Kale for hosting this conversation and giving us this platform to share a little bit about what we're tracking as it relates to federal policy. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning. I think this is the 5th or 6th time that I've had the opportunity to come down for the Kale conference, and always a favorite for me. But I think what a pleasure it is to be amongst folks who ballrooms filled with people who are committed to adult learners and workforce development. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope that you'll gain something through this discussion that will benefit you in your work back at home. A couple of quick notes before I bring our excellent panel into this. One is that we want to keep this as fact-based as possible. We know that it's been a tumultuous year, to say the least, in terms of what's been going on in Washington. All of our organizations have been following these developments incredibly closely and hope that we can shed a little bit of light on it. But as much as possible, we're going to stick to analysis and sort of a fact-based update on what we're hearing. But we're not going to necessarily give you a blow-by-blow. We're going to try to highlight some of the most important developments, and then we are going to take some questions. I'm not sure how we're going to do that, but the Kale team will facilitate that. So as you listen to the conversation, please keep in mind that there's an opportunity to raise some questions at the end. And so last bit about our 3 panelists, representing, as Matt mentioned, sort of 3 cross-sectional perspectives across our sector. So Melissa brings sort of the public workforce development perspective through her work, both as head of NAWDP and also as a former regional workforce development board operator. John, as head of AFA, understand that there are many AFA members in the room. So our resident apprenticeship and work-based learning expert for purposes of this conversation. And Alex, who probably stayed up until 2 a.m. reading federal regulations in the Federal Register last night, kind of carrying the higher ed and student finance perspective. So with all that being said, let's dig into it. And, would love to just pose an initial question to each of our panelists to sort of kick things off. With all the things that have happened in the past year, even in the last 24 hours with the official end of the government shutdown, what do you think is the most significant shift in federal policy that is going to impact adult learners? And I will kick it off by turning it to Melissa to start.
Well, I think, one of the things that I want to focus on specifically with this audience in our discussion is the workforce Pell. So that was passed in this recent big piece of legislation. It goes into effect, July 1, 2026. So programs, if they're not read, right? Yeah, remember what's on paper.
On paper, I'm sorry, facts.
Yeah, facts.
Right, sorry, facts.
So, we definitely want to focus on that. And I think, the push to partnerships specifically with some of the requirements around the workforce Pell, with your program, when does it become eligible? When can we start utilizing that? The tracking, the outcome requirements, those types of things are going to require a lot of partnership. I don't know that it's a big shift from what we've seen, but I think there is an emphasis on who the customer is. So leaning into the apprenticeship side and the business customer, some recent reports that have come out from labor really are going to emphasize the business customer, which obviously workforce and education, we support that business customer. But again, it starts with the partnership.
Makes sense. John, same question. Biggest shift for the past year?
Yeah, I think what we're really seeing is an acceleration of a reconsideration of our College for All policy. For 60 years, I think you could say there was really one very strong post-secondary education message coming from Washington and the states, which was everyone should go to college. And what we've seen, I think that the data is starting to show that we may have reached a limit in terms of what we can get out of that policy. If you look at non-completion rates, the number of people who graduate but don't have jobs that seem to require a college degree, I think there's just a lot of questions asking now about College for All. And that has really driven then a whole set of secondary considerations. What kind of performance outcomes should we be asking from our higher education sector? What kind of programming makes sense for the higher education sector? How do we link our workforce development and higher education sectors more closely together? How do we ensure that the higher education sector is actually delivering talent that labor markets need and that is advancing earning and careers for students? And so, apprenticeship certainly has gotten a lot of play as part of that larger consideration, but it is a larger consideration that's out there. Relative to higher education spending, the workforce development spending has been much, much smaller. And I think we're seeing some signaling, workforce Pell being maybe the start of that, of thinking about how we take those higher education resources and make sure they are being directed in a way that connects people to jobs and careers. And certainly there's going to be much more to come on that. And by the way, I should say it'd be easy to say, well, that's just a Trump thing. It's really not a Trump thing. We hear it from Democrats and Republicans in blue states and red states. This broader reconsideration of the social purpose of post-secondary education and the kind of accountability regimes that should be part of it is something we're just hearing everywhere.
Perfect. And Alex, same question, biggest shift.
Yeah, I think, and this will probably be an echo a lot of what you've just said, John, but I think the mindset shift of policymakers over the last several years, don't let my age fool you about the depth of my expertise, but I think I was in high school when the idea of workforce Pell was first introduced on the House floor. And I'm not that, or the Senate floor, I should say, Mary Langeau from Louisiana. So I think that's, Workforce Pell is sort of a wave we've been seeing building over the course of several years. And now this idea of building in short-term credentialing, skills-based hiring into sort of not just the big overall one big beautiful bill moments in policy, but sort of the nooks and crannies that sort of like I feed on as a policy expert, like earlier this week or last week, we saw the Department of Education release its priorities for its FIPSI grants, which essentially, know very briefly, competitive grant programs to advance an administration's priorities in higher education, however they define them. Sort of right up there with the department's AI strategy and investing in AI this year is the expansion of short-term credentialing programs, and not just, starting new programs that are going to be Workforce Pell compliant, but also investing money directly into programs that have existed and continue to exist, right? So we won't see the grant applications just opened up, and employers, institutions of higher education are all sort of eligible, right? But these are the sort of little small things in the course of Washington policymaking that don't make the news, national or local, trade or national necessarily, that I think we see beginning to sort of permeate the environment. So to your point, John, I think it's a real shift away from college for all, but these sort of tiny policy moments show just how deep that shift is.
So the next question I want to get into, and it's timely because I don't know what time President Trump signed the continuing resolution to reopen the government, but the federal government is officially back open as of today. So give our Congress a round of applause for coming back to session after a 45-day vacation. So government's reopened, and it's been a painful sort of shutdown. Obviously, I think many of us may have experienced it up close and personal, dealing with TSA or other challenges with travel. And we know that this has trickled down and real impacts on funding and state and local programs. So needless to say, it's significant that we're now at a point that we at least have the funding to move forward. But I'm curious to hear from each of our panelists, what happens next from a policymaking perspective now that we at least are back to a point that the shutdown is over? What are you going to be watching in terms of priorities through at least the end of this year or maybe into 2026? So I'll go back to you, Melissa.
So, I think right now, yes, hopefully for anybody that flew in, this will start to alleviate some pressure in the next 48, 72 hours a week, that we'll be able to get where we need to go for the holidays. But, this was another short-term bill, right? So this just reopened the government hypothetically until January of 2026. There were definitely some longer-term amendments, if you will, that were added into the bill that fund things through September of 2026. But at the end of the day, we're still focused on funding and money, and there still needs to be agreements that are reached before we hopefully do not have to go through this again in the next month, and a half, 2 months. So I think what we're focused on is trying to make sure, ASWA, a Stronger Workforce for America Act, was reintroduced, but it was kind of a product of the last Congress. And so there hasn't been a ton of interest in bringing it up. Everybody likes to have their own priorities and their own names for things. So we'll definitely watch to see if we can start focusing on some policy things. But I think right now, a lot of the focus is on funding, which is super, I shouldn't do that, which is super impactful, definitely, to the workforce system. Although workforce development, and I won't get into the money part because that is really boring on a morning, but the workforce system was funded traditionally, like the WIOA system, but many of our workforce adjacent programs weren't. And we've been talking, this group, Workforce, all of these partnerships have been talking about braided funding for so long, because that's what actually helps our customers. So when any part of that braid breaks or stops, it definitely impacts the other portion. So my hope as we move forward is we can get some finality on some budget bills, let's actually get these things passed so we have a clear, consistent way to move forward, and then shift to policy and fixing the things that need to get fixed.
Alex or Don, responses on what to watch through end of year?
I think Melissa's right on. In theory, what should pick up now is an appropriations process, regular appropriations process. There's at least, one analysis that would say, look, we've now proven we can pass bipartisan legislation with presidential support. Let's now just run through the appropriations process bills and get that done for education, for labor, for the departments we care about, even the departments we don't care about. Let's get ourselves on a regular appropriation schedule. The other analysis is, hey, we've learned how to fight, there's certainly plenty of folks who think that the political gain is just in continuing the fights. So we could end up, at the end of January with the, back-facing more shutdown issues. I tend to think right now the momentum is a little bit with the bipartisan solutions side of things, but things change in Washington on a dime. So.
Indeed. Alex.
The only thing I would say, yes, totally agree. From the congressional perspective, I think it'll be important to remember that, the Department of Education sort of isn't necessarily bound by these sort of the congressional rhythm of things, right? Even during a government shutdown, something that we saw was a little bit atypical, but the Department of Education continued to create and promulgate regulations. It continued to run its negotiated rulemaking sessions, right, to implement the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So I think what's top of mind at the end of the year and going into next year is they're actually going to be December and January, and should be done before a government shutdown could possibly occur again, is creating regulations around workforce Pell, like you were talking about earlier, Melissa. So we'll actually have a chance to see how the department is envisioning implementing workforce Pell, what the actual eligibility requirements, right? There's some relatively high watermarks that were passed through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that programs know they have to meet. So it has to be 70% completion. There's interplay between whether you can get workforce Pell and regular Pell grants at the same time, right? So there's there's clock hour requirements in the text, but there's a lot that was sort of left unsaid and a lot left to the Department of Education and providers to sort of figure out what an acceptable use of those funds is. So I think the implementation of that is something that I'm looking into the next year. And then, of course, all of the sort of less maybe on the adult worker side, but even some of the undergraduate facing regulatory changes will also be taking effect in July 2026.
So we've been talking about the shutdown, which may be the most recent shift or the most recent development in federal policy, but it might not be the most significant. And Alex, you mentioned the One Big Beautiful Bill before, or HR1, which it's also been referred to as. So I guess I'm curious, like for the group in general, I mean, how can colleges, employers, workforce groups sort of stay abreast of the changes, or what are the most maybe significant things from your perspective for the constituencies that you work with in terms of this major piece of legislation? So reactions in terms of highlights from the One Big Beautiful Bill from the group.
Yeah, I think certainly workforce Pell is, right there. There's maybe you'll talk a little bit about some of the higher education finance changes that are pending there. But I think the broader framework that we're looking at here is, see my first comments, how are we adjusting, shifting our post-secondary educational institutional arrangements to be more relevant towards labor market outcomes, careers, and opportunity for a broader part of the U.S. population. And I think that's going to be, I think you're going to want to be tracking that from a variety of perspectives, both through, I think, the more traditional higher education policy analysis advocacy environment, but also, just know that the policy momentum is shifting towards the sort of workforce side of things. So it's important to pay attention. What's the National Skills Coalition's analysis here? What's Melissa's organization up to? What's my organization up to? You're going to be wanting to sort of hold back your focus a little bit to be looking more broadly at sort of economic opportunity policy analysis, not just the higher education work. I think that will be a danger for people in the room.
And John, you sort of teed up the question about sort of changes to the federal student loan program, which I want to come back to in a second. But Melissa, thoughts on sort of how this is impacting local workforce organizations, folks at the local county level in terms of changes in that bill?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, for sure, the workforce Pell is the big piece of that. And so that's something that, we're focused on partnership. And building on something that you said, I think that as you watch legislation go through, and I think we do need to be a little bit careful, because right now it does seem like the legislative priority is funding, keeping the government open, getting programs funded, getting them past the finish line. You guys know as well as I do that when we pass some of these short-term funding bills, there's negotiations, there's, hey, I need you to do this if you want to keep this funded. And sometimes policy gets squeezed in that way. So making sure that you are looking at the broader picture. I know specifically with higher ed, community colleges, workforce, when we were talking about a Stronger Workforce for America Act, there was a big emphasis on this 50% training requirement. Now, when you're looking at legislation, I would implore you to keep watching the big picture, because training is fantastic. I'm all about training. I do see the huge shift into skills-based hiring, but what NADAP would be advocating for is the most flexibility in the program as possible. So when someone comes into your office and sits across the desk, they may not need help getting funding for their education. They may have access to Pell. They may have access to other training related funds. What they may not have access to is transportation assistance or childcare assistance. So if we want to keep students engaged in your programs, or we want to get students engaged in apprenticeship, workforce, that's kind of our secret sauce where we can step in there with some supportive service requirements. So, not focusing on what impacts you only in the bill, but how it actually impacts the system. And then from the apprenticeship side, again, with whether it maintains its name, we'll see how that bill progresses or changes. But we want to make sure that the systems work well together. So how can we rewrite that workforce bill to better coordinate with apprenticeship? Because right now, apprenticeship isn't widely adopted throughout the workforce system because there's some inconsistencies in the program requirements. So we try where
Fewer
we
than
can.
3% of workforce we always served individuals are in apprenticeship, I think, right?
Absolutely. And if you talk to any workforce development professional, we will stack hands that apprenticeship is a fantastic work and learn model. We love it. It works. The success rate is off the charts. We just need to make sure that regulation wise, our programs work well together.
I want to go back to, as promised, on the student finance piece, and we would probably be able to fill a full 50-minute panel just on the changes to federal student loans. But Alex, I mean, you've been following all this incredibly closely. What are the kind of biggest, particularly for our post-secondary institutions in the room, which isn't everyone, but quite a few? What are the big takeaways? What should they be following as we look to kind of year one of implementation of OB3, One Big Beautiful Bill, HR 1?
Yeah. I think the main thing the main lens to look through everything that's coming, that has come down the pike and is coming down the pike over the next several years is effects on institutional budgets, right? So Melissa, you started talking about sort of transportation, I'd say broader sort of basic needs, right? The One Big Beautiful Bill Act made several changes to SNAP, to Medicaid that increasingly shift burdens onto states to implement these federal level policies, right? And so as states are increasingly encumbered by obligations put on them by the federal government, there's less money for, say, public institutions, right? Some of this is going to depend on where you sit in the market. Are you public? Are you private? Are you 2-year? Are you 4-year? Are you shorter than 2-year, right? But overall, you have to be looking at sort of the sum of everything and its effect on institutional budgets, right? So one example of that is new caps on graduate and professional loans, right? That's a not insignificant amount of revenue coming into the institution through tuition that cannot be covered by Pell Grants, right? So you think about that, you think about, if you want to go way far out, the rise of NIL, sort of how that squeezes institutional budgets and how for the sector of institutions that's relevant for, more and more money has to be funneled to their athletics programs, right? Little things like that. Think about student housing. Again, back sort of to this basic needs idea, what institutions have to do given where we are in housing and affordability in the country to ensure that their students have a place to live, whether that's a 4-year degree, or I've heard institutions in rural areas providing, 6-week short-term housing for upskilling workers and then sending them back to their employers, right? So there's a slew of policy changes coming down. Of course, I think institutional budgets are going to be impacted in a variety of ways. And I think if you can just, as you're reading the news, as you're reading legislation, getting the analysis, if you can take a step back in your mind and say, okay, how does this realistically affect the institutional budgets? I think you'll be in a good position to stay on top of whichever way the tides change.
So I want to move on in a second, but before we move off of the One Big Beautiful Bill, and just wanted to quickly get sort of, because it was, if nothing else, it was one bill, it was big, beautiful, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I suppose. So, but there's a lot to unpack with this bill. So many different things affected. Anything else, just like quick highlights or things that folks may not have, changes in statute or programmatic funding that folks in this room should be aware of before we move on?
Go ahead, Alex.
One thing I would say is sort of the new institutional accountability measure, and this gets back to what you were saying earlier, John, about sort of a rethinking of where we are in sort of our college for all position. Sort of there hasn't really been a statutory requirement for institutions to sort of do no harm, as it were, to produce graduates whose earnings are better than the average high school graduate's earnings in that state, right? And now that's something that's officially law. We've had that for sectors. We've had that for the for-profit sector through sort of gainful employment regulations when they are being implemented. But we've never had that sort of broad base, no matter who you are, for every institution. This is the value that you have to deliver for your students. So that's one that I would say.
John, observation?
Yeah, if I could just say, just back to Workforce Pell, in the budget scoring, if I'm remembering right, in the budget scoring for Workforce Pell, it was budgeted at $300 million, which is actually pretty modest if you think of it. And I would just say to this audience, I am hoping that budget scoring is wildly wrong. And so let me just caution one thing. There's going to be a tendency for institutions. We've actually seen some institutions go through this process. They look at the Workforce Pell requirements, they look over all their programs, workforce programs, and then they see, oh, well, we've got maybe one program or no programs that really fit. So this isn't for us, we're done. Please don't let your institution go through that exercise. Look out in your communities, ask where there are Workforce Investment Act programs or nonprofit funded programs that might fit those the Workforce Pell rules, and figure out how you might be able to form partnerships, adjunctize the instructional staff in those programs, bring them under the institution, and think about how you can then provide steadier funding, more funding for expansion, more funding for quality. Those are all going to be opportunities presented by Workforce Pell. We'll learn more in the next month as we begin the rulemaking processes around that. And I just want to encourage everyone in this room to be thinking expansively around how Workforce Pell might be able to be used, not just for the programs you're running now, but for broadly the needs in your communities.
I want to take our attention elsewhere, and I don't know how we're going to facilitate it, but I think we are able to take some questions. Is that right? Okay. So should I send people to a specific place in the room, or raise your hand and we'll bring a mic around?
Great.
So the last couple of minutes, we'll take some questions. On the campaign trail, we heard a lot about sort of the shift to close, shut down, or end the Department of Education, dismantle it. So I wanted to check in with this group to sort of do a little bit of a reality check and see where we are at that. And so, in terms of just like the changes that have been made, obviously there was a major riff at the department, a lot of offices being moved around. There also, as to Alex's point, been a lot of activity. So curious to get perspectives from this group. If that was the goal, how much progress has been made? The Department of Education is still open for anyone who wasn't aware, but curious, where are we on this whole sort of like shutting down the department or dismantling the Department of Education from perspectives from the group?
I'd say, one thing that we always say is sort of personnel is policy, right? So to a certain extent, the amount of resources that the Trump administration is pulling out of the Department of Education, whether that was through the first round of reductions in force back in March or the one sort of about 450 more employees at the beginning of the shutdown. So on that point, I would say, they're making modest progress towards that goal. But I think that the department also performs sort of a lot of legacy functions, as it were, right? It serves as the accounting department of the 6,000 institutions in the country in many ways. It serves as sort of an HR function, right? The Office of Civil Rights is constantly dealing with civil rights complaints, Title IX complaints, right? Even with the staff being reduced. So, I think while there's sort of I don't want to say symbolic, but certainly nominally, there is sort of a reduction in the footprint of the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., but it continues to operate much as the Department of Education has, just with fewer staff. Now, I would say there's sort of a dichotomy in sort of how this plays out on the K-12 side and how this plays on the higher ed side. I think very, very broadly, I wish we had more time to dig into it, right? But the K-12 platform for the Trump administration is a very fundamental rethinking of how we do K-12 education in the country, rethinking how we distribute funding, to whom, what the eligibility requirements are, whether it's all one big block grant or whether there's separate funding streams for separate things, right? The higher education side is not something that the department and the Trump administration have sought to disrupt in the same way. They definitely have their own ideas about how the student loan repayment system should work. But broadly, they've kept the similar structures in place for making regulatory policy. They use the same processes, right? So, and that's also reflected, for example, in who gets prioritized when the government shut down, right? So majority of the staff that were left at the department were federal student aid workers, right, to continue administering federal student aid. And it was the K-12 workers who often provide technical assistance to local state education agencies who were laid off and, overwhelmingly impacted by the reductions in force at the beginning of the shutdown, and also were furloughed during the government shutdown. So say there's kind of a dichotomy. On the K-12 side, there's a bit more of there's a bit more progress towards shutting down the Department of Education, but I would say they probably still have a long way to go to mirror that on the higher ed side.
So I would add that I think some of this too is looked at as a forced alignment, right? So there's some perspectives at the national level that that they're going to save time, money, resources, et cetera, by forcing some alignment. And there's pros and cons with that. I think, depending on where you are, sometimes it looks like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and we could have reworked some things. But at the end of the day, the reason that some of that is coming into play is because there isn't alignment at the local level. There isn't the partnership that probably needs to be happening. And again, we'll use Workforce Pell as an example. There's definitely, like the completion, the 70% completion rate, the 70% placement rates. There's some tracking that's going to have to be done coming out of these programs, and then post when students, employees get into their profession. So, again, I would urge you to align workforce. We've begrudgingly had to track placement and outcomes. That would be a really good way to start partnering on how are we going to track. And, I would second what you say for sure. Don't look at the requirements of some of these and say, nothing fits, so that's not for me, it doesn't apply. Take advantage of this opportunity and create those partnerships right now. Because I think that being in the game, working with your workforce system, working with those local partners is going to benefit you and your institution long term.
Anything else to add? I mean, one thing I wanted to call out is there has been, they've had some success, the administration, in terms of, creating these interagency agreements between DOL and the Department of Education. And so thoughts on that, I guess, John or Alex, John in particular, I'd love to get your take on sort of the activity at DOL and the movement there.
I think right now, I think we're at the level of the agreement. I don't think we've gotten to the substance. That would be my take. So what we're talking about, I think most specifically, is the Office of Career and Technical and Adult Education, OCTE, which is, I think, physically been moved into the Perkins building at the Department of Labor through a cooperative agreement of some sort. And so what we haven't seen, I think that happened just a couple of weeks before the shutdown. We haven't really seen what that's going to mean substantively in terms of policy, but the signaling is pretty clear there. And so how Perkins is going to be better aligned with Department of Labor priorities, how the adult education we owe a title is better aligned or more aligned. I mean, we're going to have to see sort of how that all plays out. But the signaling is, as I say, very clear.
And I want to stay with you, John, just for 1 second on a question about apprenticeship. Just really dig into that topic as we before we pivot into questions. We have seen, just to your point about signaling, even in the first Trump administration, a really heavy focus on using the levers of the federal government to expand apprenticeship. So what's the latest there? There was an EO earlier this year. There's changes to registered apprenticeship and other models. What's the latest in terms of federal apprenticeship?
Yeah, so for those who don't follow these things, there's no reason you wouldn't. They would follow these things closely. So last April, I think it was, the Trump administration issued a couple of executive orders focused on workforce development, talent building for the nation. And they went over a number of different things, artificial intelligence and its roles, working to get a more efficient workforce development system. But there was no question, you couldn't read those and not conclude that there was a real privileging of the apprenticeship model in the administration's thinking around workforce development and talent preparation. I think this really speaks, first off, to the critique that is going on right now in traditional post-secondary education. Also a recognition that among workforce development strategies, apprenticeship is largely understood to be sort of a gold standard in terms of the kinds of outcomes it's getting to. And I think there's some broad worry about where labor markets are going, this increasing experience premium that seems to be currently in the hiring process, and how you get people experience in labor markets if that's now increasingly a requirement even for entry-level jobs. So with all that going on, the administration really put its finger on the scale in terms of wanting to see more apprenticeships, set a goal of growing apprenticeships to 1 million. That's from about 680,000 right now. And in talking with folks from the Department of Labor, they were absolutely clear. They were being measured on progress towards that goal. So I don't think that's an idle goal that's out there. I would say sort of 4 things that have come out of that now, and then a bunch of things that are sort of on deck. One thing is in our Workforce Investment Acts, in the Workforce Investment System, you're now seeing apprenticeship being one of the performance indicators that's being used to assess how workforce boards are doing. I think that's likely. There's going to be more push, especially with a potential WIOA reauthorization, to drive that. The second thing that we're seeing is that in the funding mechanisms around apprenticeship, there's a real push to getting money into the states to support this work. The state apprenticeship expansion grants, one of the first grant programs that the Trump Department of Labor proceeded with. And I think in there, they're signaling lots of interest in getting states into sort of the role of running apprenticeship, maybe getting the federal Office of Apprenticeship out of the business of running apprenticeship. More to be seen on that. And then finally, I'll just say we've had a taste of some new rulemaking from this administration. So new rules on the equal opportunity component of the rules around apprenticeship, that significantly streamlined some of those structures, and I think signaled the department's interest in streamlining more generally the regulatory processes around apprenticeship. I'll say one last thing, though, that in Trump 1, there was a lot of talk about something called IRAPs, these non-registered apprenticeship programs, and there was quite a bit of effort to try and sort of develop that as a program. In this administration, it's not on the table. It is all about registered apprenticeship. There seems to be a consensus that that's the system we're going to work with. I think they have strong interest in reshaping that system, but that they're really focused on the registered apprenticeship system.
Was mentioned. I would
Yeah.
love to bring you in, but also respond to John's commentary if it makes sense.
Well, I think we also need to take advantage. So knowledge is power. We don't need to wait on new legislation to do new things. So for instance, one of the crossovers for many years between education and workforce has been this eligible training provider list system. If you have anything to do with ETPL, which is what we call it, you probably don't have good, bubbly Thanksgiving feelings about the ETPL. One thing about apprenticeship, it doesn't matter if that program or training is not on your ETPL. If it is a registered apprenticeship, it will fast track that program. That's in the existing legislation. So understanding and being able to utilize what we have available now while we wait on something new is a huge advantage. And then a friend of ours always says big P, little p policy. So big P policy, the OB3, all of that got passed. Regulations now are being talked about. Implementation dates are being talked about. We can still impact policy and how this is carried out on a day-to-day basis by impacting what we would call the little p, the regulation portion of the policy. So just because something has passed legislatively doesn't mean that your voice isn't still important, because you can still impact how that is actually carried out in the minute details.
And did you want to, we do want to open it up, but I see we have our mic here. So if you are interested in posing a question to our group, maybe stand and be recognized so Elizabeth can bring the mic to you. Before we do that, we'd love to just get kind of a quick update on WIOA and any prospects for the year ahead, if there's anything for this group to be aware of.
Well, I don't know that I have a ton of information. Like I said, a Stronger Workforce for America Act was a product of the last Congress. We really thought that there was would have been Christmas a year ago, maybe, that we really thought ASWA was going to maybe get to the finish line. Now, I don't know that it was perfect, but it did make some headways in some things. And at the end of the day, WIOA, we wanted our legislation to be reauthorized, right? That was the important part. WIA, the Workforce Investment Act, changed to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act under the Obama administration. So I believe that was back in 2015, 2016. So we're working on legislation that's 10 years old at this point. Workforce changes a lot in 10 years, and the requirements needed to effectively carry out and help students and job seekers changes greatly in 10 years. So we would definitely like to see the changes. But again, we're just with this new Congress, they haven't really taken it up in any significant form or fashion yet. We try to watch it because every once in a while, like I said, we'll be talking about labor funding or some other kind of appropriations, and it'll bubble to the top again, and we want to make sure that it's right there, but nothing solid that I'm aware of that we can stand on right now.
I'll say it's one of those things week by week. My assessment sort of changes. The latest, though, I'll say, just because why not share the latest? I think there's at least conversations going on in committee staff on both the majority and minority committee staff that suggests to me that at least there's possibilities for it in this Congress. So we'll see.
Well, with that being said, I think we have time for a couple of questions, and I think we have a question right here. So would love to hear what questions you have for the group, and please, because we only have so much time, please ensure that it's a question, not a statement.
Not sure this is on.
It is.
It's a really short question, actually. I mean, thank you very much for sharing everything. It's a lot of information. I feel like I'm listening to a great podcast. But you know, colleges, higher education, we can't turn the dime. We're big institutions, right? There's a lot of moving parts here. You're giving us a lot of information. Where do you think we should focus our energy most right now? And where should we be watching? We can't, unless you guys are going to start a podcast that we can listen to every week. Where are we going?
It's not a bad idea, actually.
Yeah, where can we look for good guidance, right? Outside of the political disparities, right? We want focus, we want direction, we want reliable information. Where should we be looking? Thank you.
So I'll say, at least on matters of apprenticeship, please come to our website, apprenticeshipsforamerica.org. Sign up for our mail list. We probably on a weekly basis put out a little policy update. I just did one this morning on the government reopening. And our aim in that is to get information out quickly. It might not be perfect, but quick. And with a brief summary of why we think it's important that people should know about this. We're proud of the policy work that we're doing on this. Apprenticeship is not covered by a lot of other organizations, so we're very happy to do that. And then I'll just say, I think, on the change process, even as there are lots of changes happening in Washington, D.C., I'll just say, I think all of us are sort of focused on a longer term goal here, right? What should the public workforce system look like going forward? How does post-secondary education fit the needs of a changing economy? And how do we think about scaling apprenticeship so that it's on par with the kind of performance we see in other industrialized countries? These are not things that happen in one Congress, much less 1 year or a couple of months. These are multi-year processes. And I think the work of everyone on the panel is really, focused on those long-term objectives.
And I would also plug Melissa's, I would plug Whiteboard Advisors.
Definitely Whiteboard Advisors.
Subscribe to Whiteboard Notes. We have a weekly newsletter where we track sort of the best or worst of what's going on in the federal policy landscape. So you can get updates from us that way. We're whiteboardadvisors.com. And then Melissa's organization, both John and Melissa's organizations are fantastic resources. So if you're not already a member and you're a workforce practitioner or involved in apprenticeship delivery, please get to know these guys. They can be incredible resources in terms of navigating kind of federal policy.
Thank you for the question, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. It is definitely hard for education because curriculum takes time, planning takes time. And, that's been something that's been hard to overcome for a long time. People don't get laid off in July so they can start school in August, and they don't get laid off in November so they can start, we're not on those kinds of timelines. So it is important to be as knowledgeable as possible upfront, so you guys do have the time to do the curriculum and planning that you need. I agree, with not signing up for newsletters, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. I will tell you from the not up perspective, we don't take a lot of hardline stances on advocacy issues politically because we focus on frontline staff across a huge programmatically diverse system. So we have educators, apprenticeship, training providers, just all of these different folks. Again, I would say if we did stand firm on something, it would be flexibility, because we want to make sure that the student or job seeker that's coming in, if they need training, we need to get them into training. If they need work boots, we need to get them work boots. If they need childcare, we need to get them childcare. So the more flexibility that's in the legislation, the better. But yes, please sign up and or reach out. Maybe we should start a podcast.
There you go. Okay.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you to John, Melissa, and Alex for their time. So please give a big round of applause to our three panelists. And thank you again to Kale for having us. So please stop by and visit. We'll be here and look forward to continuing the conversation. So thanks again.
I can tell you something. This concludes this morning's session. If you head out, you can go check out some workshops. As an FYI, The hotel will be coming in here to set up for lunch. So please, if you want to hang out, go hang out in the foyer or a different area so that the hotel can begin that setup. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.